Africa observes the National Day of Reconciliation. It's an annual commemoration meant to foster unity in the aftermath of apartheid. This year's theme is healing historical wounds, forging new futures, highlighting the country's ongoing journey towards reconciliation and unity as we recover from a divisive past. Let's talk about the state of reconciliation in South Africa. And Nomfundo Mogapi, the CEO and founder of the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership, joins me now. Nomfundo, it's lovely to have you with me. And I love days like these because I get to see people in the flesh. So I've shared the theme of today, which is healing historical wounds and forging new futures. How do you, as a professional in the space, define the wounds that South Africa still bears in this moment?
Yeah. So I think when we're talking about the work of democracy in our country, I always talk about differentiating it between the hardware of democracy, which we've begun to do, but we haven't done enough of it. There's still a lot of work to do in changing the lived experiences of South Africans. And then there's the software. And I'm really excited that we are beginning to take the issue of healing seriously in our country. But before we even talk about it, I really want to emphasize that the two have to go together. So when we are talking about healing our historical trauma, it's about understanding that it doesn't matter how much policies we change or programming we change in our country. If we do not heal that which wounded us, we will continue to sabotage ourselves. And I think for me it's really sad that the whole concept of appreciating that apartheid and colonialism wounded us, broke us, has been used almost like a political mileage. So people are even scared to look at it, that if we do look into it, we're going to be told that we're too damaged to do the work. It's been used in political spaces. But we need to return back and understanding, as a clinical psychologist that work with issues of trauma, we now understand that the part of the brain that we need to help us to achieve democracy, to engage with each other, is completely different from the part of our brain that holds our pain. And if we do not heal our pain, we will be led by the pain that has hurt us.
Do you notice, Nomfundo, that there seems to be a fatigue and a dismissiveness around, 30 years, come on, guys, you're still talking about wounds, you're still talking about pains. When do you get over it?
Yeah.
And that's somewhere I want to go actually in the next question, because your focus is on the psychological impact. Apartheid policies were about collective punishment. They were about brutalizing the individual. And we've seen so many studies done on the humiliating effects of apartheid on black people specifically, and how at that time in our history it also engendered arrogance in white people. Family life was disturbed through the migrant labor system. We saw the behavioral development impact and stunted growth in terms of malnourishment, because there was extensive childhood malnutrition. We've seen mental breakdowns and so on. How does that still link to the future? When we talk about intergenerational trauma and legacy trauma, how does that actually work, especially for those people who don't believe it exists?
Man, I'm so glad you asked that. You know, for the past 20 years, I worked on issues of violence and democracy. And that's why 3 years ago, I decided to start the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership. Because as a psychologist that specializes in trauma, there was so much that we are learning in the trauma field around how trauma can impact individuals, societies, collectives, group, and historical trauma. We are now learning that through epigenetics, that if we do not heal our trauma, we transfer the genetic expression of the trauma to the next generation. And I was realizing in Africa generally, I mean, I just come from Tanzania where we're doing some of the work in Sierra Leone, but in South Africa specifically, that the downfall of Africa in our continent won't be because we don't have excellent policies and programs. It's because we haven't fully appreciated the depth and extent of trauma and its impact on us, and how that trauma can get infused in our systems and in our policies and in everything that we do. Trauma will continue to sabotage us if we don't deal with it, and it will be. The next generation, instead of spending their energy trying to rebuild South Africa, they'll be spending their energy trying to undo our traumas. And I am seeing it in the thousands of people that I've worked with, that the trauma of South Africa is alive, and it is impacting corporate South Africa, public sector, and everything that we do.
I've got the next question's got a bit of a lead in, so please bear with me, but it does speak to the theme that we're now teasing out. There was an interesting piece in the Mail and Guardian in October around the concept of a colonial legacy and the impact on this generation. So we're talking about young professionals, specifically young black professionals, who face things like financial crisis. So a closer look at the underlying causes of the financial crises and the paradigm they find themselves in is not just about financial literacy or black tax. It's about deep-seated historical factors that stem from colonialism and apartheid, what you're talking about, which stripped entire generations of wealth and opportunity, forcing many into a vicious cycle of survival. And I want to read just a direct quote. Young professionals are pressured to provide for themselves, provide for their families, their aging parents, sometimes their siblings, while they're trying to build their own financial futures. And there's a psychological weight associated with stepping into that role. So much burden and pressure on them to perform and provide.
And there's another added layer that we need to talk about. When I talk, I always say that doing democracy, development, or even just being a professional in a country like South Africa is trying to be a professional in a wounded society. So you have to sort of navigate these traumas and these wounds. So for these young people, it is not just the present burden, right? It is the burden of the fact that historically, for centuries, there was socioeconomic exclusion. So the idea of not having money and not paying is about navigating ancestral trauma. Remember, it gets transformed from one generation to the next. So the pain of the fathers, the grandfathers, the great-grandfathers, and ancestors sit with these young professionals. So I've seen young professionals who help their family at their own peril, but they have this sense of urgency because they are thinking, helping my family is about undoing the trauma, and they don't even know the agency that it actually brings. So there is this added layer that we need to understand that we can, yes, help them to, some of the work I do, I talk about financial wounds and financial trauma. I am amazed at how we take money. For example, we've got the 30 of Democracy project, but we put it in the hands of some of us who are deeply wounded because money is about your worth, and apartheid was about attacking our sense of worth. So there is wounds from both those that were previously disadvantaged and currently, and those that were previously advantaged, where you were told that you are better than another person just because of how you look. And if we are to get reconciliation, we have to go back and heal those wounds and really understand what trauma did to us.
I want to go back to epigenetics, which you talked about, and this is the intergenerational transfer of trauma to a point where it can actually alter your DNA.
Yeah.
Is it, and this is for the cynics in the room, is that an accepted, is there consensus around the concept of epigenetics when it comes to trauma?
Yes, not just consensus, there's scientific proof that it happens. So, I mean, the way that it happens is that you know, we've got our genes, but we've got amino acids that helps us to express certain genes. So let's say, for example, around issues of worth, right? If we get traumatized, my parents got traumatized 370-something years ago, and when they were traumatized, there was a genetic expression with the trauma of humiliation that says, I am not good enough. That's how I cope. I'm not good enough, so as a black woman, I'm going to shrink, I won't show up. If I don't heal as Nomfundo, I will transfer it to my daughter. And she finds herself in spaces where she's supposed to show up, but her genetic expression around worth is, I am not good enough. And the thing, I mean, that we are also finding now is that it takes 4 generations to completely shut down a gene. So when we are telling, for example, young black women to show up and trust themselves, we are telling them to navigate woundedness. We are telling them to go and deal with a genetic expression of something that was never part of, you know, that was taken away from their DNA. It's a scientific fruit. That's why, like, unless we deal with this, people will keep on looking at our continent and saying Africa is failing without appreciating what colonialism did to us at a genetic level and at a psychological level.
I mean, it's really, really deep stuff and really thought-provoking stuff, Nomfundo, that you are sharing with us. If we look at the whole impetus for this holiday, it's all about fostering reconciliation and national unity. The piece that you're talking about suggests that there needs to be a whole body of work that needs to be done that almost is the beginning point, and policies then follow to muscularize that objective.
Yep.
So how do we do this now?
Yes. So the work that we're doing now is focusing on what we call trauma-informed approaches. I'm looking forward to a day where we have a trauma-informed South Africa. So trauma-informed approaches is very different from trauma-focused. In 1994, I was also, you know, part of the movement where we thought the trauma was with the victims, those that were affected, we need to do counseling. But trauma-informed approaches says we need to appreciate that almost everyone in our society has been impacted by trauma. We have to use it as a lens to analyze and understand all the problems that we have. If you're going to design an entrepreneurship policy, what does it mean to have entrepreneurs that are wounded, that have money trauma? How do you use it as a lens in terms of how you design it? It's to look at how do we change our policies, but most importantly, which is something very close to my heart, is leadership, is to heal our leaders. I want you to imagine this. We have this amazing policy around reconciliation, and we tell a leader, let's say it's a white leader who's told that you must go and implement this, but he doesn't know that in his DNA is this deep-seated shame around, you know, having had a privilege that is related to this. So the minute, remember I said the part of our brain that stores our trauma is different, which is our limbic system, is different from our cortex. So his cortex says, yes, it's reasonable, let me do it. But the minute it comes, it triggers that shame. So he blocks off, he puts off these things and he doesn't do it, and he doesn't even understand why he acts that way.
You're talking about the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex.
Yes, because the prefrontal cortex is the one that we need for democracy, the one that we need to lead. However, the trauma is in our limbic system, and the amygdala is part of our limbic system, which is the emotional brain. So if we don't heal that, if we don't heal what is in our limbic system, we can have these amazing policies that require our cortex. When the limbic system is activated, it deactivates the cortex. So they can't operate together. So my argument is we have to, now it's a body of work, it's fairly new, it started in 2016, and more countries are beginning to take it to say, how do we become trauma-informed? How do we infuse the trauma work in our policies, in our organizations, in our leaders, and in everything that we do? South Africa needs to do that. Otherwise, we will continue to sabotage ourselves. Our politics will be led by our limbic system, our homes led by our limbics. I talked about this 20 years ago when I was a new psychologist, and it pains me because I can see the trauma playing itself out in our society.
And that limbic system you're talking about is what triggers that fight or flight survival instinct. And part of that is negotiation as well, negotiating, you know, your safety. I really wish we had more time to actually talk about that, because it's what you see more viscerally in society. You can identify it in the way that people respond or react to trauma. You know what's so interesting? So we crossed, and you would have seen us cross to Nobuhle in KwaZulu-Natal in our crossing, and she shared a really interesting breakdown of the history of this particular day and the renaming. So if you think about in apartheid South Africa, the 16th of December is known as the Day of the Vow. The Voortrekkers, in preparation for the Battle of Blood River in 1838 against the Zulus, took a vow before God that they would build a church and that they and their descendants would then observe the day as a day of thanksgiving should they be afforded a victory. And we know that for the Zulu nation, there's a different association for it. And then now nationally, we have a third association with the day. So there's a fair amount of debate about this and national events which speak to aspects of our history that also have trauma kind of tooled into it. For different demographics in our country, there's a different association made, and yet we're striving for unity. So how do we bring people with different historic associations around a day, for example, like this, of some significance, and get them to see a way that is different to the way that they might want to commemorate it?
Because you see, I mean, I always say when I talk about trauma, especially collective healing, and it's a concept I've borrowed from a guy who wrote Everyday Trauma, and he says trauma looks for three things. Trauma looks for a witness, somebody who is prepared to sit in the pain and say, I see you, I acknowledge your pain. For validation, to say what you've gone through is unfair and it was painful, and then for a tribe. Now, unless these experiences of KZN have truly been felt and heard and processed, there will continue to be a contestation of these things. And what we try and do is to interact with the cerebral cortex, try to reason with the pain. So I wonder if currently we are even at the point where we must be looking at what unifies us rather than saying, can we go back and heal what has divided us? We haven't done the work. We haven't done sufficient, let me not say the work, we haven't done sufficient work.
Before we close, give me a practical example of how we can do that work. I mean, if somebody says, okay, I heard Nomfundo, and I think that there's an opportunity here in our community to begin to do some piece of that work.
Great.
How could they initiate
And
that?
the good news is we're already doing it through the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership. So, for example, we will go into the community, we will do what we call the river of life of the community. So the community says, what is our history? Where is our pain? Where is our pain point? We will then look at how has this impacted you? How have you responded? As you know, some of them, you talked about the fight or flight response. How does it show up now? So, and then look at, okay, what are some of the ways in which we can do it differently? So by just sitting and doing the river of life and being heard, you are moving the pain from the amygdala and you are moving it to your cerebral cortex. So we need to do some of those things. And then what we're also doing a lot is training leaders, because leaders can either exacerbate or they can contain the trauma. So really talking to leaders on what is your role in a wounded society as a leader. Because if you are irresponsible, you can activate people towards more violence rather than towards peace. And most of our leaders, and I want to close by this, the crisis of our society is not that we're wounded and have gone to trauma, but is that we are asleep to how wounded we are, and we continue to bleed on the very same exciting programs and systems that we have.
Wow, that is powerful. And, you know, you talked about the river of life as a tool of practice and a tool of healing. It's also a tool of diagnosis in being able to see where was the, you know, the first incident that led to whatever it is that you feel negative about, even 30, 40, 50 years on. It's a very, very powerful tool. Thank you so much for stopping by. I immediately feel better through our energy exchange. Nomfundo Mogapi is the CEO and founder of the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership. Thank you very much for her time today. Well, Nasipi Same is standing by at the official Reconciliation Day event, and she will tell us what's happening there in just a moment.